Before we begin, I want to take a moment to honor the cultures behind the stories we are about to explore. The tales shared here come from many peoples, lands, and traditions. I do not change these stories to fit modern expectations or to align with today's social standards. Instead, I present them as they were told, sometimes beautiful, sometimes harsh, sometimes challenging. We are not here to judge the past, but to understand it, to listen, to learn, and to honor the ancestors who carried these stories forward. We also share stories from various religious traditions. These are presented in their historical and spiritual context, with respect for their beliefs that they represent. Every culture deserves respect, context, and acknowledgement, and this space is dedicated to doing exactly that. August 21st, The Hardening. Story 1, Fudō Myōō, and the Sword of the Immovable. He stands inside a wall of fire and does not move. His face is fierce, his body dark, his teeth bared, and in his right hand rises a sword sharp enough to sever something far more difficult to cut than flesh. Delusion itself. This is Fudō Myōō, the Japanese form of the Buddhist deity Achala, whose name means immovable. Fudō became one of the most powerful figures of Japanese esoteric Buddhism, particularly within Shingon, and his appearance was designed to communicate strength that had already been tested and set into place. He is frequently shown planted upon rock, surrounded by flames, carrying a sword in his right hand with a rope in his left. The sword represents wisdom, capable of cutting through ignorance and delusion. The rope restrains destructive passions and draws wandering beings back toward the Buddhist path. But it is the fire surrounding him that makes the image impossible to forget. Fudō does not flee from it. He does not struggle desperately against it. He remains inside it. Japanese Buddhist art developed elaborate forms of this fiery imagery, sometimes surrounding Fudō with a blazing halo whose flame takes form associated with the sacred Karura, derived from the Garuda of Indian tradition. His sword could become equally extraordinary. In imagery associated with the Kurikara sword, a dragon coils around the blade, creating an emblem so closely associated with Fudō that the dragon and sword can represent his presence even without depicting his human-like form. Yet none of these terrifying elements make Fudō a figure of uncontrolled fury. His wrath has purpose. The flames consume obstacles. The sword cuts ignorance. The rope captures what would otherwise continue wandering. Even his name insists upon equality at the center of his power. He cannot be shaken from his purpose. That relationship between Fudō and sacred fire becomes physical in Japanese Buddhism rituals, known as goma. In goma ceremonies devoted to Fudō, wooden offerings are placed into a consecrated fire while mantras and prayers accompany the ritual. The flames understood through the imagery of Fudō's wisdom fire in the burning away of obstacles and defilements. Medieval Japanese records preserve detailed instructions for performing these rites, demonstrating how deeply the fire ceremony became embedded in devotion to the immovable wisdom king. And so, the figure remains before the flames, sword raised, rope held ready, feet or seated body anchored against stone. Fire surrounds him, without changing his direction. That is the peculiar power of Fudō. Heat is normally associated with transformation, with something becoming softer, melting, bending, or changing shape. Fudō represents what happens after the essential thing has already been set. The fire may still rise, the world may still pull. Obstacles may still appear, but there comes a strength that no longer needs to prove itself by escaping the flame. It stands within it, knows what it is, and refuses to be moved. Story 2, Wieland the Smith and the Vengeance of the Captive Forge. Long before the name Wieland became attached to one country, stories of the legendary smith traveled through the Germanic world. Wieland in Old English, Volundir in Old Norse, Wieland in German tradition, a craftsman so extraordinary that later heroic poetry could identify magnificent weapons simply by saying that his hands had made them. But the fullest surviving version of his story, the Old Norse Wolunder Vitha, does not remember the master smith living freely beside a glorious furnace. It remembers him captured. Wolunder had lived alone in Wolfdales, forging hundreds of beautiful golden rings while waiting for the return of a woman who had left him. When King Nithother learned that the famous craftsman was vulnerable, the king's warriors came while Wolunder slept and seized him. Nithother took the smith's magnificent sword for himself and gave one of Volunder's treasured rings to his daughter, Bolthvilder. But possession of the smith was not enough. The queen looked at the captive and recognized something dangerous still alive inside him. She advised that his strength be taken away. Volunder's hamstrings were cut, leaving him unable to walk normally, and he was imprisoned upon the island, Stather, where he was forced to continue forging treasures for the king who had stolen his freedom. The punishment was calculated with terrible precision. Nithother wanted the hands without the man. He wanted Wieland's skill, while ensuring the smith could never use that skill to escape him. But the forge remained in Volunder's hands. And eventually the king's two sons secretly came to the island seeking the treasures they believed he possessed. Wolunder killed them. Then the smith transformed their bodies with the same terrible craftsmanship that had once transformed precious metal. He covered their skulls in silver and made them into drinking vessels for their father. From their eyes he fashioned jewels for their mother. From their teeth he created an ornament. Their revenge becomes darker still when Bolthver later comes to Wolunder, carrying the broken ring her father had taken from him, and asks the smith to repair it. The poem describes Wolunder giving her beer until she becomes overcome by drink and then having sex with her, after which she leaves in distress and later reveals she cannot resist him and is pregnant. The episode is deeply disturbing, and the poem does not transform Wolunder's suffering into moral purity. The abused captive becomes capable of inflicting horror upon people who did not personally order his mutilation. Then comes the impossible escape. The surviving poem is deliberately mysterious about how exactly Wolunder does it. But suddenly, the crippled smith rises into the air. Later versions expand this into artificial wings or a feathered flying device. But Wolunder Kvoya itself leaves the mechanism uncertain. From above, beyond the king's reach, Wolunder forces Nithother to hear the truth of what has happened to his sons. The king, who once controlled where the smith could walk, now stands helpless beneath the man he cannot reach. Wolunder flies away, but the poem does not end triumphantly with him. Its final words return to Bolthvilder and her grief, leaving the wreckage behind him in full view. That is what makes Wieland such a brutal figure for the hardening. Captivity does not merely make him stronger, it makes him harder. And the old legend refuses to pretend those are always the same thing. Nithother can steal the sword, sever the tendons, imprison the body, and command the forge, but he cannot remove the knowledge living inside the smith's hands. Yet neither does suffering automatically make those hands righteous. When Wieland finally escapes, his captor has failed to break him, but everyone touched by the revenge has been changed by the heat. Story 3, Kaveh the Blacksmith in the Banner of Rebellion. In the great Persian epic tradition, there came a time when a ruler named Zahak sat upon the throne and terror spread beneath his reign. In the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, Zahak's corruption is made monstrous in physical form. 2 serpents grow from his shoulders, and they must be fed with the brains of young men. Day after day, families lose their sons to the appetite of the king's curse, and fear becomes part of ordinary life. Among those families is the blacksmith named Kaveh. He's not a prince, not a priest, not a commander, but a working man whose forge has taught him what he can and cannot do. Metal can bend when it is hot enough, but once shaped and hardened, it can resist forces that would have broken it before. Zahak's officials eventually summoned Kaveh before the court and placed a declaration in front of him, a document praising the king as just and righteous. They want his name beneath the line, but then, according to the epic tradition, nearly all of Kaveh's sons have been taken from him. He has buried enough grief, he has swallowed enough obedience, and in that moment the blacksmith does something the entire machinery of tyranny depends upon, people refusing to do. He says no. Kaveh tears the declaration apart before the court and condemns Zahak openly. Then he leaves the palace and raises the leather apron from his forge upon the spear, turning the simplest object of his trade into a banner. People gather beneath it. What had protected his body from sparks and hot metal now becomes a symbol of a rebellion. That apron will later be remembered as the Darash Kaveh, the banner of Kaveh, one of the great legendary emblems of Iranian kingship and resistance. Kaveh leads the people toward the young hero, Feridun, who has his own claim against Zahak, and who eventually rises to confront the tyrant. The rebellion grows. The king, who demanded false praise, discovers that obedience has limits. And for Ferdowsi's telling, Kaveh's power comes not from magical blood or divine weapons, but from the point at which suffering has been heated past submission and set into defiance. He knows exactly what Zahak's reign costs because the cost has entered his own house. The forge matters here not because Kaveh uses a hammer to defeat the king, but because everything about him belongs to the world of making, endurance, and fire. A blacksmith understands that raw material changes under pressure. He also understands that a thing can be reheated, reshaped, and made stronger than it was before. By the time Kaveh raises his apron above the crowd, grief has already done its work upon him. The man who might have once bowed to the throne now stands before it hardened enough to refuse the lie. Story 4. Gu, Lord of Iron and the Road Through the Wilderness. Before the road can carry people, someone must cut through what stands in its way. And in the sacred tradition of the Fon people of present-day Benin, the power of iron belongs especially to Gu. A Vodun associated with iron, smithing, tools, weapons, labor, and the human ability to transform the world through craft. Gu is often described as a son of the creator figure, Mawu Lisa, the complementary divine powers associated with the moon and sun. And one tradition tells when the Vodun descended from the heavens forward toward the earth, they encountered a world that could not simply be entered. The land before them was wild and obstructed. There were forests, tangled growth, and barriers that prevented the divine company from moving forward. Others attempted to find passage, but it was Gu who possessed what the moment required: iron. With an iron blade in his hands, Gu moved ahead of the others and began cutting. Branch after branch fell, vegetation opened. What had been impassable became a path. Gu did not merely follow the road into the world, he made the road possible. That image became inseparable from his sacred character. Iron in Gu's hand was not simply material pulled from the earth. It represented transformation through knowledge, heat, strength, and deliberate action. The blacksmith takes something hidden inside stone, subjects it to extraordinary heat, works it beneath repeated blows, and produces an object capable of changing the conditions of human life. A hoe can open earth for planting. A blade can clear land. A tool can build a dwelling. A weapon can defend or destroy. Iron itself does not choose what the hand will make of it. And Gu therefore carries both the creative and dangerous possibilities of technology. He became associated not only with blacksmiths, but with those whose lives depended upon iron. And as technology changed, traditions surrounding Gu could extend his domain to machinery, vehicles, and other metal tools. Yet the forge remained at the center. The smith who worked iron participated in an activity carrying sacred weight because transformation requires mastery of elements that appear almost alive within the furnace. Earth yielding ore, air feeding flame, fire changing metal, human hands hammering the heated mass into form. Across West African traditions, Smith could occupy distinctive social and spiritual positions because their craft seemed to cross boundaries between what the earth concealed and what human beings could create. For the faun, Gu embodied that tremendous possibility. He could clear the wilderness because he possessed both the material and the knowledge needed to overcome it. And there is something beautifully uncompromising about the old image of him advancing first. The obstacle does not disappear because Gu wishes for a road. He strikes it. The blade meets resistance again and again. The path exists only afterward. That is the hardening hidden within Gu's iron. Strength is not merely surviving heat, but becoming useful because of it. Ore buried in the earth cannot clear a forest. Iron left unworked cannot become the blade. The transformation requires furnace, hammer, repetition, and hands that understand exactly when the metal is ready. Gu carries the finished thing into the wilderness. And where there had been no passage, suddenly others can follow. Daily thread for August 21st. How am I stronger now? Strength is strange because we usually recognize it only after we have needed it. We imagine strength as something loud, something that announces itself through victory, confidence, or the ability to overpower whatever stands in front of us. But today's stories give us 4 different versions of what happens when something has passed through enough heat that it no longer responds to pressure in quite the same way. The hardening is not about becoming cold. It is about discovering what has become more difficult to bend away from its purpose. Fudō Myōō stands surrounded by flames, sword in one hand and rope in the other. Yet his defining quality is contained within his name, the immovable one. His strength does not require the fire to disappear. The flames can rise around him and still he remains anchored, cutting through delusion rather than allowing it to determine his direction. Wieland gives us a much darker version of hardening. He is captured, mutilated, imprisoned, and forced to continue creating for the king who took his freedom. His knowledge survives everything done to his body, but his story refuses to pretend that surviving suffering automatically makes someone better. Wieland becomes harder, yes, but his revenge spreads suffering outward to others. Hardness and strength are not always the same thing. That distinction matters. Pain can teach us boundaries, endurance, discernment, and courage, but it can also become bitterness, cruelty, or the belief that because we are wounded, we are entitled to wound someone else. Then comes Kaveh, the blacksmith who has lost almost everything a tyrant could take from him and is finally asked to surrender one more thing, his agreement with a lie. He refuses. The leather apron that once protected him from sparks becomes a banner, and the private grief of one father becomes public resistance. His strength is not that Zahak failed to hurt him. Zahak hurt him terribly. His strength is that eventually fear can no longer purchase his silence. And finally, Gu enters the wilderness carrying iron. He does not stand before an impassable landscape and insists that strength means pretending there are no obstacles. He cuts a path through them, blow after blow. What could not be crossed becomes something others can walk through. That gives us today's question. How am I strong now? Not how do I avoid being hurt? Not how do I become unaffected? Not even how did everything that happened to me make me better? Some experiences do not deserve gratitude. Some fires should never have been lit. But you can refuse to give those experiences ownership over everything that came afterward. Look instead at what you can do now that an earlier version of you struggled to do. Maybe you say no sooner. Maybe you recognize manipulation faster. Maybe you leave when something repeatedly violates your boundaries. Maybe you ask for help instead of carrying everything alone. Maybe you have learned when to fight, and equally importantly, when fighting will only turn you into another Wieland, carrying the wound forward into someone else's life. Maybe you trust yourself more. Maybe you can still sit inside uncertainty without immediately abandoning your direction. Maybe you have finally stopped signing your name beneath someone else's version of who you are. That is strength too. Hardening does not mean becoming impossible to touch. Properly tempered metal is not valuable because it is incapable of movement. A blade made completely hard can become brittle and shatter. Strength requires something more complicated. Enough hardness to hold an edge and enough resilience to survive impact. Perhaps we are the same. We do not need to become stone. We can remain tender where tenderness belongs. Flexible where flexibility serves us, and absolutely immovable where something essential must be protected. So today, acknowledge one way difficulty has refined rather than weakened you. Do not thank the difficulty if you do not want to. Thank the person who endured it. Look at something you can carry now. Recognize now. Refuse now. Create now. Or walk through now that once seemed impossible. That is evidence. You have already been inside the forge. You have already heard the hammer. Now, notice what held its shape. Strength is not proving that the fire never hurt you. It is discovering that after everything the heat changed, there are parts of you it cannot make surrender.